Okay, welcome everyone. It's 10 past 4, so I will call us to order, if I will. Thank you everyone for joining us at this point in the semester. We're very, very pleased to have Varuni here today, but before I introduce Varuni, just wanted to make a couple of announcements. The first is that next week next week we will have, next Thursday and Friday, the center's last two events of the semester, both of which are with Amitav Ghosh, who's going to be in residence next week. So the center is co-sponsoring an evening at Hill Auditorium next Thursday, December 6th at 8 p.m., a program called Celebrating Tagore, and Amitav Ghosh will be making introductory remarks at that event, which is free and open to the public. And on Friday afternoon, Amitav will be speaking in a venue titled the Authors Forum, which is taking place at 4 p.m. on Friday, December 7th. And that's going to be in Hatcher Library, in the main library's gallery. That's what it's called. Thank you, Lee. So in the gallery. So this is a wonderful opportunity. Please don't miss these events, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. But today, we are very, very pleased and privileged that our colleague, Varuni Bhatia, has agreed to share her work with us. Varuni is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures who joined the University of Michigan in 2010. So still a relative newbie, I guess, in some ways. She came to us actually from in a sense two institutions, the New York University, where she was an assistant professor and faculty fellow in their religious studies program, and she did that upon completing her PhD from Columbia University in South Asian religions. So Varuni is going to be giving a talk today that is titled Chaitanya and the Politics of Recovery in Colonial Bengal. This is actually also, it seems, the working title of her book, her manuscript in progress. So we're very pleased that she's going to be sharing this with us today. Please welcome Varuni Bhatia. Thank you.
Thank you, Farina, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me to present my work here at the center. I've been a part of this center ever since I arrived at the university 2 years ago, and this has been a lovely, warm home for me in many ways. So I'm really happy to be here and presenting my work here. So I'm just going to hop into my paper. Just before I begin, what I would like to say is that this is a bit of a work in progress in the sense that this is how I am trying to rework my dissertation into the book that eventually must come out of every dissertation. So what I'm trying to do over here are my attempts at reworking the dissertation into the book. What I will be presenting over here to you is I imagine it to be one of my chapters. I imagine it to be the chapter that lays the groundwork for what is going to follow. Not necessarily the introductory chapter, but definitely the chapter. Is that better? Yeah. So, but definitely what will come right afterwards. So I would like you to bear that in mind when you ask me questions, and any feedback that you give will be really helpful at this point. In the aftermath of the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, historian, folklorist, and scholar of Bengali literature, Dinesh Chandra Sen, delivered a series of lectures on Bengali history and culture at Calcutta University. Each year between 1911 and 1921, Sen lectured on topics as variegated as the Ramayana in Bengal, folk songs of the region's lower provinces, pre-modern Bengali literature, Bengali prose style, and so on. Sen, an exemplary romantic archivist of the Bengali cultural life, used these lectures not only to present to his audience a vast and rich repository of Bengali literary works spanning centuries that he had unearthed. he also placed these works within a coherent narrative of the literary history of Bengali language and its intimate relation with the crystallization of Bengali culture and identity at the turn of the 20th century. And over the course of his discursive enterprise, there was one pre-modern Bengali figure that Dinesh Chandra Sen turned his attention to more than once. This was Chaitanya, the late medieval scholar, devotee, and mystic who, by the time that Sen was writing, had emerged not only as the fount of Vaishnava devotionalism in Bengal, but also as a great social and religious reformer who had set into motion a period of Bengali reformation. Not only is Chaitanya hailed as a Bengali apostle towards whom Sen is particularly favorably prejudiced, Chaitanya's companions are posited as a necessary corrective in an age of Muslim domination in Bengal, and his followers are accredited with making landmark contributions to the development of Bengali language and literature. While the literary material that Sen presented in his lectures within an institutional setting in post-Swadeshi Bengal were novel for its time, his enthusiastic appraisal of Chaitanya was not entirely so. Rather, it drew upon almost half a century of re-evaluation that Bengali Vaishnava traditions and the figure of Chaitanya had already undergone. In fact, Bipin Chandra Pal, that well-known nationalist leader, a Brahmo who turned into a neo-Vaishnavite and an astute observer and chronicler of his times, writes in his memoirs that the causative moment of a resurgent interest in Vaishnava traditions amongst Western-educated Bengalis was a lecture on Chaitanya delivered by moderate nationalist and lawyer Surendranath Banerjee at a meeting of the Students' Association in Calcutta in early 1870. Pal notes that Surendranath Banerjee specifically drew attention to the message of social uplift in the religion preached by Chaitanya. But Banerjee was not the only one to emphasize Vaishnava contributions to Bengali cultural heritage in the 1870s. Historians of Bengali language such as Ramgoti Nyay Ratna and Ramesh Chandra Dotto, and individual collectors of Bengali oral literature such as Akhay Chandra Sarkar were also beginning to extricate the immense contribution of Vaishnava literature to Bengali language in the period of our inquiry. Such appreciation of the various cultural aspects of Vaishnava devotionalism, literary, social, as well as religious, was a rather novel phenomenon in colonial Bengal when it began. For the preceding decades had been characterized by a widespread promulgation of the decline thesis of Bengali Vaishnavism, and they were marked by a measurable apathy of the educated Bengalis towards these traditions. Horoprasad Shastri, member of the Asiatic Society who also held the office of the Bengali translator to the government, thus describes this disregard of educated opinion towards Vaishnava literature. And I quote, "In the initial years, when schools were introduced in Bengal, people would read only translations from English into Bengali. That Bengali had a large literature of its own, and a history of that literature no one knew." End quote. Counting himself amongst such indifferent Bengalis, Shastri evinces much surprise upon finding a number of books covering Vaishnava themes, both in printed and in manuscript form, in the collection of the Bengal Library in 1886. In the next 2 decades, indifference would be replaced by intellectual curiosity, followed by almost a scramble to collect, archive, preserve, and memorialize literary and material artifacts of Chaitanyite Vaishnavism that would culminate in the reappraisal of Bengali Vaishnavism in the works of folklorists such as Sen and historians such as Jodunath Sarkar, who also writes his own version of the biography of Chaitanya. From the beginning of the 19th century, Vaishnava traditions had come under considerable attack in the print-generated public sphere in Bengal from a variety of quarters. Evangelicals such as William Ward, Brahmo reformers such as Ram Mohan Roy, and colonial administrators such as William Wilson Hunter each criticized local Vaishnava practices and the larger corpus of Vaishnava theology for its moral corruption and philosophical bankruptcy. In the age of what has been characterized Bengali liberalism, Vaishnavism emerged as the oriental mirror of Christian Catholicism. with its avaricious priestly class, a passive and servile laity, and a feudal relationship between man and God. With the emergence of the politics of culture in Bengal, and particularly after the 1870s, there came about a significant shift in public discussions on Vaishnava traditions, such that these discursively evolved from being considered as a religion of the people of the very lowest description that encourages an indiscriminate and most licentious mixture of the sexes, and these are words from Reverend Ward, to a rich complex that had an everlasting influence on the glorious expressions of Bengali history, literature, society, and religion. By the turn of the 20th century, a major shift had taken place. From a supposedly degenerate devotional traditions of the 1860s to a source of fruition of the Bengali language in 1870s and 80s, Vaishnava devotional traditions had turned to becoming a unique expression of the genius and character of Bengali people. And this is in the words of Bipin Chandra Pal by the turn of the 20th century. My attempt in this paper will be to draw attention to the intellectual context of the process of regeneration of Chaitanyite devotional traditions in Bengal and briefly trace a modular moment that will shed light on this process amongst educated Hindu Bengalis. Why does a medieval mystical figure prone to ecstatic excesses, according to his hagiographers, and considered an avatara or manifestation of Krishna by his followers, emerge as a cultural icon? What intellectual and political economic conditions prepare the ground for such an understanding of Chaitanya to emerge in our period? And how are popular devotional traditions associated with Chaitanya and his companions translated into the realm of culture, given that they were seen to bear the burden of all that was wrong with Hindu religion barely a few decades ago? This was neither a spontaneous nor an inevitable process, but a result of a conglomeration of a number of factors. Primary amongst these is the narrative of Vaishnava decline, to which I will now turn. So decline, or change for the worse, Peter Burke reminds us, assumes a variety of metaphors in European intellectual history between the 14th and the 18th centuries. To earlier and arguably non-historicist understanding of cosmic decline caused by divine causes were added ideas of moral and cultural decline caused by natural causes and political and economic decline as a result of human causes. By the 19th century, and with the institution of historicism as the framework for reading the march of human civilization, decline assumed a clearer dialectical relationship to the idea of progress, Renaissance or Reformation, with the latter encapsulating a change for the better. If progress was the inevitable that must be wrought, decline served as its dialectical opposite, the other that must be overcome, indeed that will be overcome. As Reinhard Koselleck has observed, and I quote, during the 18th century and the time since then, it has become a widespread belief that progress is general and constant, while every regression, decline or decay occurs only partially and temporarily. Progress has become a world historical category whose tendency is to interpret all regressions as temporary and finally even as the stimulus for new progress, end quote. Within the historiographic tradition, the idea of decline makes a grand entry with Gibbon's late 18th century text, The Rise and Decline of the Roman Empire, a text that remains until this day a convincing argument about the eventual political decline of an empire in order to make way for a profoundly new and improved future. In Gibbon's text, gone were the earlier notions of decline. Influenced by history and with progress as its benchmark, Gibbon presents the decline of a lumbering imperial behemoth as the precondition of the emergence of the modern age, the present, so to speak. Decline here is natural, everything must decline, including empires, but also man-made. Hence, Roman bureaucracy is held centrally responsible for its eventual demise. Within a historiographical framework, we can discern two related but distinct features of decline that distinguish historical decline from earlier conceptualizations of the same. One, there invariably exists a human cause for decline, and two, decline forms the necessary precondition for teleological extension, the opposite of progress. And by the mid-19th century, as Thomas Metcalfe has pointed out, progress was no longer an arguable issue for English thinkers. It had become an unquestioned metaphysical assumption. Vaishnavism in 19th century Bengal was a religion in decline, according to most contemporary observers. Writing in 1921 and echoing what he had heard from the last one century of observers on Vaishnavism, American missionary Melville Kennedy observes in his monograph that, and I quote, "After the vigorous expansion of the 17th century, the fortunes of the sect seem to have gone under a cloud that lasted for nearly 200 years. After this, we have nothing of importance. The sect seemed to have burnt itself out and have sunk gradually into a lethargic state, with neither leaders nor spirit worthy of its tradition." End quote. A century before Kennedy, Baptist missionary William Ward finds in Vaishnavism an image of everything that he finds abhorrent about Hinduism in general: moral turpitude, ritualism, priestcraft, idolatry, and polytheism, thereby laying the grounds of the decline theory that would enjoy an enduring presence repeated time and again in subsequent narratives. Colonial and later reformist narratives of Vaishnava decline, however, served not only to implicate the common religious practitioner for his moral perfidies. More importantly, it was a condemnation of a civilization's collective lack of socio-religious progress through the process of Reformation and its ultimate fulfillment in Christianity. After all, the same time that these opinions about degeneracy and decline were being expressed, Vaishnavism was a robust and popular faith, with all markers pointing to a thriving socio-religious complex with no sign of the so-called decline. Popular culture, music, and entertainment, festivals in Bengal were steeped in Vaishnava themes. A third of the population of Bengal practiced some form of Vaishnavism. Radha and Krishna, Nimai or Gaurango, which is the name for Krishna Chaitanya in Bengal, and his companions, Godai, Gadadhar Pandit, Nitai, Nityanando, and Sribas, Srinivasacharya, as well as Haridas and numerous others, were worshipped as local heroes, simultaneously human and divine. Bengali literature from the past 3 centuries, if not more, bore a profusion of themes, narratives, characters, and genres derived from Chaitanyite and pre-Chaitanyite Vaishnava traditions in the region. Prominent royal families of Bengal, such as the Vishnupur Rajas, were committed Vaishnavas who patronized Vaishnava sects, abbeys, and festivals. Many amongst Calcutta early colonial Novu-Rish trading families were Vaishnav. The architectural map of Bengal was dotted with small and large Vaishnava terracotta temples from the 17th and 18th centuries. Vaishnava decline existed, therefore, less as a historical event and more as a discursive strategy to showcase a lack of adequate spiritual and social progress and advancement amongst the Bengalis. Colonial narratives of decline received its own interpretations within the class of Bengali Bhadralok who pioneered Vaishnava reform and recovery in the second half of the 19th century. Two distinct but intertwined strains mark their endeavors, and I deal with both of them in my larger work, although I will be talking only about one of them in this paper. I characterize them as the romantic nationalist type and the religious reformist type. In both cases, I show, the framework of Vaishnava decline produced not only the discursive conditions for its regeneration, but also determined the nature of the regenerative program. Within Vaishnava circles, Gaudiya reformers admitted to decay and decline in the original purity of a tradition taught by Chaitanya. They sought to streamline Vaishnava devotion in Bengal through a process that involved a Protestant-like remaking. Guided by standard reformist notion of personal endeavor that informs spiritual improvement, the site of this regeneration was the abstract individual, and its aim was a refashioning of the self as a modern religious subject, resulting in the creation of the modern institutional apparatus of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, that has today attained a formidable global presence. The Romantic nationalists, on the other hand, as I discuss in the rest of this paper, reject the idea of decline that had thus far appeared as a specifically colonial concern, informed by liberal, progressive, or evangelical paradigms. Decline is increasingly understood in terms of loss, thus making Chaitanya and Chaitanyite traditions simultaneously available for a culturalist appropriation, where Chaitanya appears as the icon of Bengali character and genius through the centuries. And it is to this that I now want to turn. So this section is titled Recovery in an Age of Culturalism. In 1898, one Ranjan Bilash Rai Chaudhary rues in an article that appeared in the Vaisnava journal Vishnupriya Patrika that, and I quote, "Our Gaurango used to wear a dhuti like other Bengalis, eat rice and mochar khonto, relished his vegetables, and spoke in the Bengali language. Will we Bengalis refuse to recognize this Gaurango?" End quote. And just to let you know, mochar khonto is raw banana curry and is actually quite delicious. Despite the impassioned tone of this query, it was hardly a rhetorical one in the historical and intellectual context wherein it had been raised. Turn-of-the-century Bengal witnessed a period of high colonialism, marked by the end of the liberal phase of imperialism after the Mutiny of 1857 and the instituting of what has been called colonial rule of difference. From the 1870s and with the enactment of various legislative measures, the participation of Indians within colonial administration was curtailed. Salaried service had emerged in the preceding centuries as one of the primary means available to the natives for social prominence. Educated Bengalis had started to increasingly turn to this form of salaried service with the destruction of indigenous capitalist enterprises earlier in the century, and this leads to the formation of a Hindu-dominated Bengali middle class, or what has been called the Bhadralok. Around this time, we find in Bengal early attempts made by native elites to form associations that intended to protect elite interests on the one hand, but also served as practicing ground for the configuration of civil societies that would ultimately lead to anti-colonial formations. It is doubtful, however, how far the idea of a national collective had permeated prior to its active cultivation by public intellectuals in the late 19th century, in Bengal and arguably in the rest of the subcontinent. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay is often referred to in scholarship as the key moment of departure, whose literary satires, novels, and essays served to raise consciousness of the self as a colonized subject. Indeed, in Bankim's literary work, we find a clear articulation of a national collective that is forged in opposition to an outsider that must be vanquished. However, it was not merely in opposition to the figure of an inauthentic foreigner, however flimsy or tropical that might be, that the idea of nation could be founded. This had to go hand in hand with a self-constitution of a people into a believable and feasible collective. It is in forging such a sentiment that romantic notions of the past come in handy. In Bengal, the region that we are concerned with here, the contours of the romantic imagination were variously iconized. The pastoral beauty of the native village, the Arcadian past of the land, and the essential auspiciousness of its women being some of the most widely deployed tropes. Familiarized to the European romantic imagination as a result of Western education, the educated Bengali male was often quite comfortable with the poetry of Wordsworth and Shelley. Indeed, an imagined notion of the land, its people, and their pasts were often discussed in tandem with romantic poetry, as the passage below that appeared in a Bengali essay on Wordsworth and Shelley shows. And I quote, it's a longish quote, so please bear with me. "In the words Duhita, all that you understand is a small girl. To me, that simple girl is a goddess, the support of family affection, the delicate creeper of our love, the cynosure of our eyes, and the embodiment of joy. In her I find Uma's face like the rising moon. Imagine her teaching the swan its walk on the shores of the Ganges. Again, the word Duhita reminds me of the early history of the land of the Aryans. I see the hermit's daughter in her leafy cottage, milking the cows in the pure light of dawn. This recalls, in its turn, images of forest recesses used for meditation. The hermit's sons, the blue smoke of oblations curling through the green leaves, the twitter of birds mingling with the rhythmic chant of Gayatri. And you and I use the same word duhita. Does that mean that both of us are the same? End quote. These idioms of intimate familiarity with an imagined past formed what Dipesh Chakrabarty has called the poetics of nationalism. And I quote, which in the middle of the everyday help to transport one to the level of the transcendental, end quote. Bengali Vaisnava traditions provide us with a unique window into this romantic imagination. Like the Duhita in the quote above, Gaurango, in the quote that I begin this section with, appears as an icon of poetic intimacy and alienation, not with a transcendental divine of a metaphysical imagination, but the phenomenal of a romantic imagination. The land, its people, its culture, and a glorious past that had all been forgotten in the present. Loss and longing form the basis of Vaishnava metaphysics, the metaphysics of Viraha. Such expressions are thus not entirely novel within the paradigm of Vaishnava thought. Nevertheless, this form of nostalgia is now informed not merely by a metaphysical notion of loss, but also by a historical notion of loss. As an example of such articulations of Vaishnava loss and the regenerative program that it subsequently spurred, I'm going to focus on a specific Vaishnava journal that first came out in 1890. It was brought about by the influential anti-colonial publishing house of the Amrito Bajar Patrika, which, under the leadership of Shishir Kumar Ghosh, its owner, had gained particular notoriety amongst colonial overlords as the site of anti-colonial sentiment being expressed in Bengal. After a successful publishing career and as a public intellectual spanning the decades of 1870 to 1890, Ghosh turned more and more religious, finding succor and one could argue a certain kind of an inspiration in Bengali Vaishnavism. Vishnupriya Patrika was his attempt at withdrawing from active politics and bringing out a journal that covered religious themes. Over the next decade, the journal undertook a systematic program of searching, collecting, archiving, memorializing, and inscribing a host of texts, sites, and figures associated with Chaitanyite traditions in Bengal. Significant for us and for the argument that I'm trying to make over here are the articulations of loss that imbue much of this regenerative effort. In the leading article of the opening issue of the journal, an anonymous author, and my hunch is that this is Shishir Kumar Ghosh himself writing, describes his first visit to Navadvip, the birthplace of Chaitanya. Prior to his arrival, the author expects to find, quote, people in Nodia reciting the name of Hari day and night, involved in no other task apart from singing Hari Sankirtan, end quote. The author prepares well for his visit. He changes into fresh, new clothes before disembarking on the sacred soil of Navadvip. Upon landing, he is overcome by sentiment and breaks down, crying uncontrollably at the sight of this land. He has imagined the caretaker of the town to be a beautiful Brahmin boy. Every person he meets on the street of Nodia, he wants to bow down to and embrace in a devotional fervor. He desires to tell them that he would be obliged if the residents of Chaitanya's own village give him lessons in devotion. However, he is in for a rude shock, and let me talk about it in his own words. And I quote, I saw two people approaching and talking among themselves. Despite being natives of Nodia, they were not indulging in Bhagavat Katha. They were talking about everyday things as ordinary people do. I discerned they were probably not Vaishnavas. I had heard that these days inferior people had found their way to Nodia. They must be one of those. Thereafter, I saw two Vaishnavas walk my way. I heard them talk about ordinary things as well. One of them was even discussing commercial ventures in a loud and excited fashion. They too did not discuss the Mahaprabhu. They seemed to have entirely forgotten that they were inhabitants of Nodia and devotees of the Mahaprabhu." End quote. Our distraught author was not the only voice of concern to speak from the pages of this journal. We hear time and again of the lost sacred biographies of Chaitanya, abandoned abbeys and seats of Vaishnava worship, misplaced idols, forgotten festivals, and in the most extreme example, a missing place of birth. The journal actively sought to recover as many of these as possible. It invited submissions of Vaishnava manuscripts that were authenticated and published, and there was a whole politics behind that process of authentication. Carried ethnographic descriptions of obscure sites where Chaitanya or one of his major disciples are worshipped, promoted a popular Vaishnava festival amongst its cultured Bhadralok readership, and gave its support to the efforts of a bureaucrat and theologian, one Kedarnath Datta Bhakti Vinoda, when he discovers Mayapur across the river from Navadip as the exact and most authentic birthplace for Chaitanya. Now, Vishnupriya Patrika did not merely concern itself with Chaitanyite material culture. It was also actively involved in the recovery of Vaishnava ethics and subjectivities that had purportedly been lost to a whole generation of Western-educated Bengalis. It encouraged the cultivation of humility and posited subalternity and powerlessness as a peculiarly Vaishnava way of being. Its readership consisted primarily of educated upper-class Hindu Bengalis in the Calcutta and the Mufassal towns who made a living through salaried service and were particularly amenable to such articulations of an enfeebled subjectivity. However, these articulations were not merely an expression of Vaishnava piety. They were as much a response to the social and economic transformation wrought about by colonialism, as Hugh Urban has recently demonstrated in his study of the Karta Bhaj, which is one of the orders of Vaishnavism found in Bengal, and the unique expression of devotion that has been found in their poetry. So Urban study kind of looks at this poetry and excavates it for something beyond just devotional fervor. And he finds in this poetry an expression of concerns with a new kind of economic order that is being put in place. Drawing from such non-Bhadralok Vaishnava orders, such as the Karta Bhaj, they were a well-known lower caste Vaishnava order and were clearly non-Bhadralok in their membership. So drawing upon such non-Bhadralok Vaishnava orders, such as the Karta Bhaj, while simultaneously dismissing them as deviant and inauthentic, the Bhadralok contributors to the journal often referred to Chaitanya as Kangaler Prabhu, Lord of the Poor. It is worthwhile to note that the mystic is rarely referred to as Krishna Chaitanya, the lofty-sounding Sanskrit name that he adopted after becoming a renunciant. He is variously called Mahaprabhu, the Great Lord, Kangaler Prabhu, Lord of the Poor, Nimai, the nickname that was lovingly given to him by his mother, or Gaurango, the fair-bodied one, thus resonating with the intimacy and emphasizing the regional association with Chaitanya that was being promoted in the journal. As Nimai, he was a precocious yet ordinary Bengali boy. As Gaurango, he was the golden-hued, adorable deity identified with the land of Bengal. And as Mahaprabhu, he was the supreme Lord who could deliver his faithful from the depredations of their collective miserable existence. As one of the contributors mentions in his essay, and I quote, "Only when the Bengalis collectively fall at the feet of Chaitanya will the condition of their religion and society improve. Only then will they be counted as a nation." End quote. Shishir Ghosh, the owner of Amritabajar Patrika, had earlier himself expressed similar sentiments in a sacred biography of Chaitanya that he authors in 6 volumes over a period of 20 years. There, he emphasizes to his readers that, quote, "we are Bengalis or Indians," end quote, when exhorting the necessity to believe in Chaitanya as opposed to, for instance, Jesus Christ. This was the stark opposition that he was building. And this faith needs to be done not just as an act of devotion, but also as an expression of national belonging. Vishnupriya Patrika's efforts at recovering Chaitanya as a cultural icon of Bengali selfhood and identity culminate in 1898 with the establishment of Gaurango Samaj, a civil society organization that enumerates as its specific aim a complete recovery of Chaitanyite material culture, not only in Bengal but also in the rest of the subcontinent. Recovery was explicitly invoked in the terms Uddhar or Punaruddhar that were repeatedly used to define the aims and goals of the Samaj, and implicitly suggested in the list of verbs deployed by the Gaurango Samaj in its program. And some of them were to spread, to publish, express, publicize, protect. And these activities were undertaken as a way of resisting the gradual destruction or the loss or slow disappearance, and these are all terms that are used in the manifesto that this Samaj prints out, of the various referents of Chaitanyite devotional tradition in the region. And if need be, we can talk a little more about Gaurango Samaj in the question-answer session. So I would like to conclude my essay by talking about, what the process a little more. Sudipta Kaviraj speaks of loss as a fundamental trope of nationalism. When seen from this perspective, Hindu Bengalis' resurgent interest in the figure of Chaitanya and Chaitanyite traditions in late 19th century, strengthened as they were by an exaggerated sense of loss, was not simply an effort to unearth an obscure or insignificant medieval devotional figure or to engage in a Protestant-like reform of religion. Rather, it indicated a denser and nuanced effort towards forging an affective community of all those who identified with this ecumenical figure, whose memory spread across caste, class, and religious affinities in Bengal, but was nonetheless deeply rooted within a form of cultural indigeneity that was peculiarly Bengali. Chaitanya and the devotional traditions stemming from him are intrinsically indexed to Bengali culture and identity as a whole. Through a process that I have characterized as recovery, both the figure of Chaitanya as well as the socio-religious and literary products of Vaisnava devotion are actively sought or archived, regenerated, and preserved. This process of recovery drew upon and responded to earlier articulations of Vaishnava decline, which formed the polemical framework of a cultural and nationalist rereading of Chaitanyite traditions. Ultimately, Bengali Vaishnavism was rearticulated as a central part of Bengali national culture. Hence, even as Vaishnava lyrics lost their meaning in the wake of an increasingly self-interrogatory and modern poetry of Rabindranath Tagore, they continued as important components of the history of Bengali literature. It is thus that Dinesh Chandra Sen would emphasize the superiority of Vaishnava poems when compared to the rest of Bengali literature, and Jadunath Sarkar would find it necessary to write an English biography of Chaitanya based upon a well-known earlier hagiography of the mystic, and Bipin Chandra Pal would write a book-length treatise on Bengal Vaishnavism, defending it as the essential kernel of Bengali character. Indeed, it would no longer be necessary to believe in the basic tenets of Gaudiya Vaishnavism or adhere to its practices of devotion. Religion is translated into culture, and a religious icon is turned into a cultural icon, upon whose memory a nostalgic past and a romantic nationalist future is duly inscribed. Thanks. Yes.
Will you field your own questions? Feel comfortable fielding your own questions?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, that's perfectly.
You know the audience.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, well.
I mean, test 1, 2. Is this on? To what extent? I mean, you've coupled Chaitya with nationalism, Is there not a way to decouple them too, at least in the beginning, and learn more about that sense of loss, let's say, that doesn't automatically flow into a narrative of Indian nationalism?
Right. No, that is a great question, and you're absolutely right that there is the part of my work that I'm presenting in this paper couples Chaitanyite traditions and nationalist resurgence in the late 19th century. But there is another aspect in my work, and that I don't talk about over here, where there's precisely this decoupling that takes place, where it is all about a certain cultivation of the self. It is not based on a collective idea. It's not based on an idea of a collective, but it is very much based on the idea of an individual. It is all about self-cultivation as a devotee. And I mentioned the name of the figure that I look at very closely for that kind of an strain within what happens to Chaitanya in the late 19th century. His name is Kedarnath Datta, and he eventually is the person. I like to describe him as the grandfather founder of ISKCON, because the founder of ISKCON is a direct disciple of his son, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. And he himself is the founder of the Gaudiya Math, which is this institutional setup that popularizes Chaitanyite Vaishnavism. The difference between them, and that's a very, very it's a different part that I was not able to present over here. The primary difference between them is that Kedarnath Datta was very keen not to have Chaitanya reduced to anything that would resemble a provincial identity. For Kedarnath Datta, Chaitanya was God infinite. I mean, he was simply God. And therefore, he was at par with any other imagination of God. He's not only does he not like this kind of a provincialization of Chaitanya, he also insists that we need to look at Chaitanya via Vrindavan, which is the main seat of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and has been of at least Gaudiya Vaishnava theology, and it has been the main seat of Gaudiya Vaishnava theology ever since the 16th century. So for him, these were very different connections that he wanted to make, and he very clearly would state that Vaishnavism is true religion. He had this whole idea of what is true religion, which is kind of Feuerbachian in the way he imagines it. And of course, Vaishnavism, Christianity, these are all parallel true religions. And Chaitanya, of course, is the God within Vaishnava religious traditions.
Can I just quickly follow up that?
Uh-huh.
Is that notion of decline and loss, is that still part of that story?
Decline and loss. This is what I'm trying to do in my larger work, is that I'm trying to say that the colonial narrative of decline gets two very different interpretations when it comes to Bengalis who are concerned with that notion of decline. One of it accepts decline per se, and those are people such as Kedarnath Datta. They accept that there has been a decline, and therefore, even though he is, well, both Kedarnath Datta and Shishir Kumar Ghosh, the two protagonists, so to speak, represent conservative Hindu opinion in this time. But I like to think of Kedarnath Datta in some ways falling within a liberal paradigm, because he simply completely accepts that there is a decline that takes place and thereafter progress has to take place. And he sees himself as the person who's going to bring about that progress. He very much sees himself as a reformer, in the line of Chaitanya, who is also a reformer. So we see in Datta this acceptance of decline as decline. And what I see taking place on the other side, in people like Shishir Kumar Ghosh, is that I see them rejecting decline and talking about it in terms of loss and in terms of forgetting. So this is not as if something was good and then it became bad. It is just that we have forgotten all about it. So it's lost to us. It hasn't really declined, which is why I'm saying that this is not it's not a liberal take on Vaishnava traditions. It's a romantic take because these haven't declined; they have just been lost, and we need to uncover them. We need to find them out again. So, I don't know if that makes the distinction clearer in what I'm trying to do over here. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm curious on the direction that Will was just taking us about this perception of decline. So you didn't mention it by the term, but were you also alluding to the notion of Kali Yuga? The Kali Yuga, and I mean, I'm curious to know, in other words, but to broaden that a little bit, is this conception of decline, is there a caste sort of specific, is this caste or class related, or is it something across the board that is a general perception that is perhaps, as you say, nationalist or colonial in its context, or is it more sort of a Brahminical discourse or some other caste that perhaps we can associate with this Vaishnava doctrine and having particular a particular angle or attitude at that time that they want to change something?
Absolutely. Well, that's it's very pertinent. I did have a discussion on Kali Yuga that I eventually took out from this version of the paper. But there are two things I want to say. If you look at Kali Yuga as an idea, not as a social historian, but simply as if you were to look at it as a concept, there's definitely a sense of decline, but it is a sense of cosmic decline. And that part on Kali Yuga was there when I was talking about historicist notions of decline and how they change earlier notions of decline. So I had a whole discussion on the fact that decline in itself is nothing new. It is not as if it is only Enlightenment historians that start to talk about decline. In fact, decline exists having lost the Garden of Eden, for instance, is a sense of decline. Or Kali Yuga is very much this large, metaphysical expression of a steady decline. But the difference that I'm trying to make, and which is where I think colonial characterizations of Vaishnava traditions as being in decline comes from, is not from these kinds of notions of decline, but it is very much based upon historicist notions of decline, where decline has human causes, where decline is and not only does decline have human or natural causes, both of them being different, but there are identifiable causes of decline. But more than anything else, decline can be turned around, and that decline invariably is something that is that comes before progress. So there's a sense that there will be progress if there has been decline. And what I'm trying to say is that when you look at ethnographers such as William Wilson Hunter, when you look at missionaries such as William Ward, and when you look at native reformers such as Ram Mohan Roy, their critique of Vaishnava traditions does not map itself out to a Kali Yuga kind critique. It's not as if, well, this is Kali Yuga and therefore everything is lost. In fact, it's the romantics who would say that more, that this is Kali Yuga and therefore it is all lost. These folks are talking more about here is a tradition and it is in decline, and these are the human factors that are responsible for decline. And there is once again a huge discussion that I have of it in my larger version of this paper, where I go into great detail about what each one of these figures says about Vaishnava traditions. And of course, the primary culprit who are accused for this decline is the priestly class, obviously. So does that kind of answer your question a little bit? Caste, on the other hand, I do want to talk about caste because it's something that doesn't get talked about in the context of Bengal too much. But caste, on the other hand, is actually quite central, and it remains central not to both sides of the debate. It's not something that either sides of the debate leave away. So, for instance, when it comes to caste, there is a sense that Vaishnava traditions needs to be appropriated for the cultured, needs to be made Bhadralok. And many of the critiques that come against Vaishnavism in Bengal is also that this is simply a low-caste religion. And which is, if you look at the numerous Vaishnava orders that exist in Bengal in the 19th century, it spans an entire spectrum of Bengali caste, of Bengali caste in this time, including many of those that would be then classified as scheduled later. So, yeah. Okay, there are quite a few hands. Yes, please, and then you, Shayan.
Okay, I enjoyed your talk. While talking about decline of Vaishnavism, I thought I'm from Bengal actually, although I didn't study these religious things much. You didn't mention about the other apostle of Bengal, Ramakrishna Paramahansa. His influence, because his ideology or the creed is totally opposed to Vaishnavism, almost opposed to Vaishnavism. So he was his influence and his disciple Vivekananda influence must have caused some decline in the, Vaishnavism, is it not?
Yes, I see where your question is coming from, and I think these are parallel movements because they happen at the same time. So 1870s is the time that Ramakrishna gains incredible acceptance amongst the Bengali Bhadralok, despite the fact that he is somebody who the Bengali Bhadralok would not turn to, in an earlier period, and there have been works that have discussed why that happens. These are, in some ways, these are parallel movements in the culturalist turn after 1870s in Bengal. But to just very briefly tell you a small anecdote about Ramakrishna and his relationship to Vaishnavism, even though he was himself a worshipper of the goddess and self-identified himself as a Shakta, was associated with Dakshineshwar and all that, he did consider Chaitanya to be a very important mystic. In fact, he acknowledged the importance of Chaitanya as a devotional figure. I'm not certain if I want to read any kind of nationalism into Ramakrishna at all at this time. Into his followers, that's a different deal altogether. So there is this anecdote where, for the first time, Chaitanya's life is performed in Bengali theatre. It's performed as Chaitanya Leela, and the person who plays the role of Chaitanya is very interestingly a woman, Binodini Dashi, who is at that time the most well-known female theatre artist in Bengal. Now, given that she is a well-known female theatre artist, there are of course allegations that she is of loose moral character. And these allegations come up time and again. People are insulted that a person such as Binodini Dashi, is the one who will be representing Chaitanya on stage. And the controversy comes to an end with Ramakrishna, who goes to the very first performance of Chaitanya Leela, is moved to tears by Binodini Dashi's performance, and he goes up and publicly blesses Binodini Dashi for the excellent work that she's done. So in some ways, I would not like to say that Ramakrishna is opposed to the thing. I would not like to make a Shakta versus Vaishnava argument over here, and rather see these as complementary intellectual processes that take place in the late 19th century.
It's true that I know that Ramakrishna was acknowledged all the other
Right.
people, but the influence that he produced in Bengal, that must have in some way caused the decline of Vaishnavism.
I see. Yeah, I see what you mean by that. Yeah, in some ways, I don't want to give a historian's answer to your question that yes, it produced, to draw that causality, because I'm less interested in causalities and more interested in what certain articulations, what purpose do they serve in a larger context. But yes, if you look at contemporary Bengal, nobody celebrates the birth of Chaitanya. But the Shakta festivals are far more important. So one could say that there has been a certain turn towards Shaktism, and one could also say that that's the more predominantly studied religious tradition from within Bengal. Bengal Vaishnava traditions have received, especially in the 19th century, have received somewhat lesser scholarly attention, and that's one could say that, Ramakrishna and his importance in that, in the late 19th century religious sphere, was important for that regard. Shaya?
I'm wondering what to make of a kind of a perception that exists in Bengali culture tradition of seeing the Vaishnavas as somehow effeminate, and the anecdote that you mentioned, Chaitanya being played by a woman. Yeah. And my parents, my father is from a Shakta family and my mother is from a Vaishnava family, and the kind of good-natured ribbing that goes on between these two traditions is that you people are effeminate, you're dancing, trance, in a trance, and you sort of not the kind of thing that masculine people do. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering what to make of this recovery by nationalists of a figure who is not only kind of a transgressive in the sense of and that can play into the nationalist paradigm, but at the same time has this potentially debilitating characteristic of being effeminate, which obviously militant nationalism will not like to be associated with.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And I think I want to say that in the late 19th century intellectual milieu of recovery that I'm looking at, I find two ways in which this effeminacy is tackled. One of the ways is through the celebration of that effeminacy. And that's something that I talk about in my work, where I say in this paper itself, when I talk about Vaishnava humility, that is talked about when there is a constant. There are all of these petitionary poetry that appears in the pages of this journal. Oh Lord, I'm so meek, I'm so terrible, I'm the worst sinner on this earth. You keep seeing these kinds of self-derogatory language that is being used, and some of it is also most of it is about powerlessness. So there is a way in which powerlessness or subalternity is celebrated as a Vaishnava ethic, and I think that is a representation in some ways of a colonized subjectivity. It feeds into the colonized subjectivity. Once again, I don't want to make an argument to say that this is only colonized subjectivity. Petitionary genres of devotional poetry have been around ever since the Bhakti movement, the so-called Bhakti movement. But there is, when it's written in this kind of a way, in the late 19th century, particularly read by the Bengali middle classes, salaried people in salaried service, so on and so forth, it serves to emphasize subalternity. But on the other hand, there is also a challenge to that subalternity, and the way in which it is done is that there is a sense of coming together. So one person may be weak, but as a collective we are strong. And that sort of a message is also given out on the pages of this journal, in the institution of the Gauranga Samaj, and I mentioned that we could talk about it a little more, so this is probably not a bad time to talk about it a little bit, is that the Gauranga Samaj eventually had an important role to play in the Swadeshi movement, because the Gauranga Samaj was in itself a number of local Hari Bhakti Sabhas in the Bengali countryside converted into Gauranga Samaj, which is to say that your local Kirtan party that would meet occasionally once a week or every single evening to sing Kirtan, which were called Hari Bhakti Sabhas, started to read the Vishnupriya Patrika, had been reading the Vishnupriya Patrika for the last 10 years or so, and when the call went out that we would like to establish Gauranga Samaj as this kind of a organized umbrella organization, many of these Hari Bhakti Sabhas converted into a member, into a branch society of the Gauranga Samaj. Now, these Hari Bhakti Sabhas played a very important role during the Swadeshi movement, and they participated actively in the Swadeshi movement. Apart from that, in 1898 or 1899, I forget exactly which year, Chaitanya's birth anniversary was celebrated as a huge public festival in Calcutta. Now, I don't know if this was continued or not later. I need to look that up and do research into that. But in 1898 and 99, this was definitely a novel thing. Chaitanya's birth anniversary was not celebrated in Calcutta. It was celebrated in Navadvip, but it was certainly not celebrated as a public festival. Chaitanya's birth, as you might know, falls on the day of Dol Jatra, which is Holi for those of you more familiar with North Indian festivals. And there was a very different fervor to that festival, even when it was celebrated. So the Gauranga Samaj actively initiates the celebration of Chaitanya birth festivities, and when this is talked about, it is mentioned in terms of a lot of otherwise weak people coming together and forming a certain strength of weakness. And the other thing that I want to mention is that there is what's emphasized, the act that is emphasized, interestingly, is the act of crying. And the way in which crying is emphasized is that crying can destabilize the public sphere, the rational dimensions of the public sphere, as well as the rational dimensions of, of citizenship, for instance. So crying becomes something that is mentioned and talked about in Vaisnava literature as an anarchic act that ought to be done. And you see elements of it in later works as well. Most particularly, I found it very interestingly, in 1829, at the death of Chittaranjan Das, who himself was a Vaishnava. It's quite interesting how many of these Bengali nationalists you dig and then you find out, oh, they came from really prominent Vaishnava families. So Chittaranjan Das, known as Deshbandhu, he died in 1929, and in an obituary that I read on Chittaranjan Das, talked about his funeral procession that went that took up the streets of Calcutta, and apparently it was a huge funeral procession. But this, the person who was writing the obituary constantly and over again repeated this as a refrain: "Cry, Bengali, cry," because you've lost a nationalist, you've lost somebody who's extremely important. So there was this constant emphasis on crying. So there is that the sense that what we see happening in this kind of appropriation of Chaitanya and Chaitanyite traditions, that seemingly enfeebling or weakening actions such as crying are translated into some form of, destabilizing acts that you can perform. That's it. Yeah, Lee?
There's many things. Thanks. It's really rich. Just on the last thing you said, the Gauranga Samaj's celebration of Chaitanya's birthday. I don't know whether anybody knows anything about the history of celebrations of birthdays or Jayantis in India, but if that was, you said 1898 or 99?
Yes.
I believe, somebody could check the date, that it was either 1896 or 1897 when Tilak instituted the Shivaji Jayanti as a protest and looking for ways in which the British could not, suppress a march. And I mean, I'm just wondering whether there's a connection there. I mean, it's just
I think there is a connection. I haven't looked at, I don't have personal correspondences or things to say that, okay, I can prove a connection, but as an intellectual historian, I can make certain claims, So I believe very much that there is a connection between those two. I think the Shivaji festival is 1892 or 93, not 96 or 97.
Could be. That then makes even another connection possible, because I think it was Vivekananda visited Tilak in Pune in 93.
Oh, I see. Okay, I didn't realize that. So not only is there a connection over there, but Tilak himself writes an obituary to Shishir Kumar Ghosh. Shishir Kumar Ghosh being the main person who really brings together the Gauranga Samaj and is the inspirational figure behind it. And in Tilak's obituary to Shishir Kumar Ghosh, he very clearly mentions that Ghosh taught us how to become a nationalist. So he says that it is Ghosh and his newspaper, the Amrita Bazar Patrika, that really taught us in Maharashtra how to do anti-colonial activism. So there's clearly, Tilak is very, very, is grateful to Ghosh for what Ghosh is giving them. And there is
another little thing just in response to the comment about Ramakrishna that I would like to also hear more about in this whole dynamic, but my sense that your response that there was a complementarity between the Shaivite and the Vaishnava is probably right. But as you know, I've been reading Helpfas's book. He cites Ramakrishna responding to Bankim, and Bankim's kind of celebration of Krishna and interpretation of Krishna, and he criticizes it for leaving out the gopis.
Yes.
And so here you have Ramakrishna bringing in the much more bhakti, Bhagavata kind of elements of Krishna than what Bankim was saying. So there was there's clear involvement in the Vaishnava discourse of Ramakrishna. My question, I mean, there's many things, but I want to kind of pull out a little more about context, perhaps in relation to class. But I'd like some elaboration of what you did with your poem illustrating romanticism, the Duhita poem. It ended with a you and I, both used Duhita. What did that mean, and what's that about, and who are you, and who is I? I mean, what is the...
Yeah, that's something that I'm myself not very clear about, to be completely honest, because this this poem is something that I saw there's an anthology of Bengali romantic essays, and I found it over there. So this, to be completely honest, it doesn't come from my own primary sources that I can put it in a complete context of that essay. But the quote, it caught my attention because of what it was possibly doing. The term Duhita taking you to, you're imagining this completely glorious Aryan past through the term Duhita. The you and I, this quote, this appeared in an English language essay on Wordsworth and Shelley, from what I can remember, and it then meant that it was a Western-educated Bengali who was probably reading the journal in which this essay appeared. So my understanding is that this is speaking to another.
Let me just speculate a little bit, because I mean, I'm just I mean, Duhita was one of the most convincing terms that Jones used to establish the link between, the European languages and the Sanskritic. I mean, because it's the one that, when it comes to daughter in English, it's one of the closest ones in English that goes that way. And so I was wondering if the you and I is, I mean, maybe Rob Willings can comment on this, but I mean, this is the you and I would be the Indian and the
right,
European.
Absolutely.
But what you said about it being, just an English-educated elite that was involved in this, I mean, makes me want to push a little bit more on this romanticism and whether this itself is just something which informs a very, very small fraction of a Bengali consciousness, that they're a Bhadralok or a Bhadra.
Right, absolutely.
Low consciousness, because at some point, I mean, I think the decline narrative itself that you're pointing out, is itself just located in a small part of the discursive world. I mean, this is the problem of the historian. You're just stuck with certain kinds of documents. But
absolutely.
We need to know more about performance traditions and poetry and dance that was going on that, even perhaps in Calcutta that would expand upon that. And that's kind of the context question, which I think leads to the caste, because this attitude that, this is of the lower people and we don't have to deal with it. At some point, that's overcome, with whatever the sense of, we're all one in this, and that, and so it's just that dimension that just seems to need.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the I'm limited not just as being an intellectual historian. I'm limited by the sources that I use, which are largely printed sources. So that makes the excavation that I do. I mean, the methodologies that I use to. It allows me access to a certain kind of material, but does not allow me access to other kinds of materials. So I think you're absolutely right in saying that this still remains very much a discursive field. Now, this is the problem.
Written discursive, but you need to have some way. I mean, this is what Novetzky seems to do when he finds reports of performances and audiences, and so that would be the kind of thing to look for.
Right.
There. But
you're absolutely right. And just to talk about that a little bit, the process that I'm trying to characterize over here as recovery did go beyond just what was being written. I mean, for instance, Chaitanya Leela, which is performed in 1984 is when I want to say, for the first time. And becomes a runaway success, absolute runaway success. And for the first time, we have Chaitanya's life that is being presented in a certain form in theater on stage. Now, theater itself is a novel form to come in late 19th century Bengal. This is removing Chaitanya from your usual Bhagavat Katha settings and putting him on a stage and presenting him, through that. Some of the if I'm not mistaken, and I could be, but the first or the second or the third Bengali film to be made is on Chandidas, who is a pre-Chaitanyite Vaisnava devotee from Bengal. And this is in 1930s. So we are looking at devotional figures, and Novetzky's work is absolutely great in that regard because he does something very parallel with Namdev traditions. He goes way back into the earlier period, looking at manuscripts as well. But he does something very similar with devotional traditions that I'm interested in as well, which is to see that how exactly are they remembered, and in different contexts, how does it that their memorialization actually changes and transforms itself.
The one other thread that you're speaking of right now, but you're using the wrong word for it, is devotee, and you're sort of avoiding bhakta bhakti.
I'm just making an easy translation.
But I mean, you're translating. But it's interesting because once we get to the words that are coined for patriotism.
Yes.
And I don't know.
Deshbhakti.
Deshbhakti.
Absolutely, yes.
I mean, it's at that point that you're creating a community, out of a word which is so loaded within a certain context, because it is what the Orthodox, would avoid. Your Vedantists, your Advaitists would,
Absolutely.
So this is suggesting. So your Bajralo coming much more out of the higher, philosophical kind of thing, are forced then to open up by this influence of Bhakta, and the Bhakta can be either Vaishnavite or Shaivite at that point. But in terms of and I like saving that rather than devotion, because we don't think of devotion as political or national or cultural, but it's clear that they have to. That's where they're forced to look for that kind of attachment. And so that's why I kind of urge
thanks a lot.
Keeping it in the other language. We can understand that. So.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. And thanks for pointing out all these things, because all these things keep coming into my head as ideas, particularly thinking about political theology in India, through the category of bhakti, and not simply through the category of what's most usually been done is to look at Savarkar's text as a quintessential politically theological text. But then if you look at bhakti and excavate the concept and how it operates in the late 19th, early 20th century, particularly how it translates into Deshbhakti. And I have read a few essays in Bengali explicitly making that translation. I mean to say a conceptual translation. I don't mean just to say that they're translating it as a term into English, translating patriotism as Deshbhakti, but saying that there is a conceptual translation that's taking place, explicating why this process is and how it takes place. So yeah, I think that's fairly. Someday I really do want to do a conceptual history of Deshbhakti, and I'm very certain somebody else will do it before I do. But that would really be where I would like to take it eventually. Yeah. So.
I suspect that it might be hard to top that exchange in some ways. So before I thank Varuni, I do need to just ask everyone to take a moment to fill out our evaluations before leaving today. It's really important for our NRC grant. And now, having said that, since I forgot to do it earlier, I can thank Varuni for a really fabulous talk.
Thanks a lot for having me here. Thank you all.